Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another December Tech Talk. This is the second in a row. So for those that participated in both, thank you very much. That was kind of you. So as you might have noticed, Terry is not here. I've hogtied him and stolen his spot, but in all honesty, I'm not very good at tying knots, so he may show up at some point. Regardless, I'll be your host and presenter today. Before I dive into our topic, I wanted to give a big thank you to our sponsor of our Tech Talks, OpenJanela. So OpenJanela is a enterprise resource planning tool, or an ERP, built specifically for the fenestration industry. For anyone that's tried to implement an ERP system for window and door manufacturing, you'll know how difficult it is to get an out-of-the-box software solution to work from for our very custom industry. OpenJanela's team is dedicated to helping making sure manufacturer software is connected from the beginning of a sale all the way through the final billing and ongoing project support while doing the seemingly impossible task of capturing all the unique elements of a specific manufacturer and their needs. Okay, that aside, let's talk about PFAS reporting. So before we actually outline what you as a manufacturer need to know to comply with Environment Canada's request for information, I thought it would be helpful to give you both a look into how the Government of Canada enacts regulations and acts using the Canada Gazette, and then unpack what PFAS materials actually are and how they came to be. For those who came for just the reporting requirements, if you come back in about 20 minutes, you'll nail kind of the brass tacks portion of this conversation. But I hope you'll stick around as the subject of PFAS materials, as far as I'm concerned, are both fascinating and disturbing. So let's jump in. So, when it comes to regulations and acts, the Canada Gazette was established in 1841 and has been how the Government of Canada gathers public comments on regulations and acts. This is also where leave for Parliament officials is posted, as well as other various national housekeeping notices. The Gazette is posted in three parts. Part one is related to public notices, such as official appointments or proposed regulations. The only way for us to have a say in those regulations and acts is to catch items being added to part one or to have friends in various levels of government that are kind enough to share those changes with us. There's an RSS feed, which, in my opinion, isn't overly useful, but you can set that up to have these items sent to your inbox. Um, there's a consultation period, usually lasting about 2 to 3 years, whenever there is a posting to part one. At the end of that consultation period, any proposed regulations that are going to go into effect will start moving into part two. Part two is all of our official regulations that have been passed, and part three are acts of parliament. So, an example of an act would be SC 23C10, which the Canadian government officially established Saturday before the first Monday of August as Food Day. Not to get distracted from PFAS materials, here's the part one post for PFAS reporting back in April 2021. This was published after some consultation with various industries. I'll admit, Fenestration Canada, in my honest opinion, was not mature enough as an organization to be having tracking for items like this. Ideally, we would have had a voice in shaping this reporting requirement. Um, what I can do moving forward is ensure that we have a voice. It's worth noting that this is not a regulation, and from our conversation with Environment Canada, it's not going to become one. It'll stay in part one limbo. There's likely PFAS requirements coming down, but those will show up in part one, and then we'll have a couple of years to provide our voice. We did request Environment Canada to come join me on this tech talk, but they very politely declined. So let's get into actually what are PFAS materials. So PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substance, also known as forever chemicals, is a family of different carbon chain molecules with characteristics of being durable, water repellent, fire resistant, and was used widely in manufacturing for many goods. Fluoropolymers are the most common that we interact with. Um, and given its popularity with Teflon. But these are also found in clothing, personal care products, and cosmetics. It is worth noting that the reporting criteria actually exempts this entire category of PFAS materials for reporting. Um, in addition to fluoropolymers, the Pesticides Act, the Seeds Act, and the Feed Act are also exempt from PFAS reporting. Um, fluorotelomers are excellent for fire resistant properties, and they're found in textiles, carpets, paper products. And in our industry, if we're going to have PFAS materials in our products, it's most likely going to be a fluorosurfactant, which is often showing up in paints, coatings, and adhesives. These are just three of the few categories of PFAS materials, but there's actually about 4,700 different types of PFAS substances in existence. So, where did this miracle material come from? There are two scientists, Fritz Schauffler and Otto Scheer, working in IG Farben, a German conglomerate who included BASF, who in our industry we would best associate with creating spray foam. And they created the first form of PFAS materials called PCTFE. The patent for this was sold to DuPont in the early 1930s, and the material, when frozen, compressed into a white liquid that we now know as Teflon. Frankly, the material was really hard to work with, and had it not been for an enormous budget and a brain trust dedicated to the Manhattan Project, the project responsible for bringing us nuclear bombs, this material would have had a very long development cycle. All the same, thanks to those efforts, PFAS materials found its first application as a liquid to coat gaskets and valves to make them more durable and heat resistant. After World War II, DuPont and 3M worked towards introducing PFAS materials into the commercial market. And in 1954, a DuPont scientist, Mark Gregory, coats his wife's cooking pans with Teflon, and the rest is history. As great as the material is, it has some significant drawbacks because PFAS materials have the ability to be absorbed via skin, although at a significantly limited rate, and the prevalence of its use in consumer supplies and food supply, its exposure opportunity is very high. Half-life is somewhere between 2 to 10 years, and biological creatures have a really hard time metabolizing the materials. This means if PFAS materials are either consumed or absorbed, it accumulates in animals and people and is slow to be dissipated. Effects on water breathing creatures is particularly bad, and preliminary research seems to point the greatest effect of PFAS exposure in Canada is on the Inuit population in Nunavut. Because the Inuit people subsist primarily on fish, the PFAS materials build up in their system very quickly. Government of Canada has started a state of PFAS report tracking the cumulative effects and exposure on Canadians, and it is ongoing. So, unfortunately, once an unhealthy amount of PFAS material is absorbed and maintained between 1 and 5 nanograms per milliliter, various health effects start to come into play. For perspective, a typical adult has 5,000 milliliters of blood supply, which puts the toxic levels of PFAS materials for an adult at 5 to 25 micrograms. About 3 to 5 grams of PTFE, Teflon, is used to coat an 8-inch cooking pan. It's reasonable to assume if you're using a spatula that scrapes the Teflon, you're likely ingesting what is considered a toxic level of PFAS material. Without just reading out the picture shown, reproductive issues, cancer, and various organ damage are the more severe effects of PFAS toxicity. So, speaking of reporting, I'd like to start this slide with a short story. I have a friend who was hired by Environment Canada to take his plane across the Arctic tundra and use a thermal camera to get a count of how many polar bears are out there. The problem is that polar bears are extremely well insulated from the cold, which also means thermal cameras are essentially worthless. Admittedly, as we were kind of unpacking this story, trying to find PFAS materials in our market is eerily similar. Manufacturers are accustomed to having a MSDS material safety data sheet, now called a safety data sheet or SDS, which have a trigger for reporting at 1% of total weight of a product if it includes carcinogens, reproductive toxins, and other hazardous substances such as PFAS. Because PFAS materials make up such a small amount of the total weight for products, it often flies under the radar. If you go through the process of getting an HPD or a health product declaration, which is a much greater reporting requirement, the 0.01% reporting is likely still too high for most products using PFAS materials for tracking. Terry and I interviewed a few suppliers here at Fenestration Canada to get a feel on how they were dealing with this and getting feedback on the reporting. And the result was that it's really hard to find PFAS material in our market. So I want to start off by saying thank you to Tony Vella from Vision Extrusions, who did a presentation for the Vinyl Institute of Canada, and I frankly ripped this right off of their presentation. But yeah, for all of those that tuned out for the first section of this, I guess we're 13 minutes into this conversation, so it's a little earlier than I expected. But yeah, this is the brass tacks portion of the conversation. So, reporting requirement is going to be for the 2023 calendar year. Manufacturing supplies with PFAS materials and the use of PFAS materials in manufacturing, frankly, are likely to fall beneath the SDS or HPD criteria. So it's going to be really like it's unlikely that you're going to wind up needing a report on this, but it's good to dig into those two portions. I would say the importing products are going to be the greater potential, but based on the conversations we had with a few of those supplier members, if you are one of the top producers of material products with fluorosurfactants, unless you are one of the big producers, you're unlikely to be triggered by the criteria. The requirement for greater than 100 kilograms is likely where you'll need to focus if you are one of the bigger producers, as it will be a 100 kilograms of weight of material that has PFAS in it. So if you've got very heavy material and you have PFAS material, that's where this particular one actually triggers well. So the government of Canada actually provided a foreign supplier letter. So if you have a importer of goods that you suspect could have PFAS material in it, you can provide them this letter that's on this presentation so that you can request that information. So let's say you are triggered to do your reporting. There are, or actually, no, backtrack on that. Not if you are going to be triggered. There are three ways that you can respond to this. So the first way is that you are triggered to respond, and you'll be submitting what's called a Section 71 response, which is declaring that your company is complying with the regulation and you've met the requirements for reporting. This requires the reporting Excel file provided by Environment Canada, filled out per their instructions in their guidance manual. We've actually provided a link here, and the instructions are on pages 21 through 37 of the guidance manual. That file would then be submitted through a single window for SEPA submissions. There's going to be a link in the next couple slides that actually will give you a guide on how to go through that process as well. And then we had actually talked with Environment Canada a little bit more on what they expect as far as reporting, and this is what they had to say verbatim. Persons subject to the notice are required to provide information that is in their possession or to which they may reasonably be expected to have access. You are not required to conduct tests to comply with the notice. However, you should make reasonable efforts to obtain information through your supply chain, especially if you know or suspect PFAS is present in your goods. This will help the government of Canada ensure that all information is considered before taking further action. So, this is the Excel file that you'd be filling out if you have to be triggered. I'm actually going to back up one step. So I've gone through now what happens if you are triggered. There's also a declaration of stakeholder interest. So if you have substances that you think are toxic or of concern, you can go through the same submittal process for this. And then if you do not have any other substances that you're concerned about, or you have done due diligence and you do not feel that you meet the reporting criteria, then you're going to submit a declaration of non-engagement. So when it comes to actually submitting, you're going to wind up doing this Excel file, which there is 8 different sections you're going to fill out. It's not overly onerous, but it is a fair bit of information to put in. And you're going to wind up duplicating that when you get to the SWIM portal or the single window information manager that the Environment Canada has this information being submitted to. Um, so if you do not have PFAS material or you don't have anything else to declare, then this is the template that you would be sending to substances at ec.gc.ca, where you'll essentially declare that I do not have anything in regards to PFAS materials, and that will be that. Um, so the submission deadline for this is January 29th. If it is not possible for you to get input from your suppliers, or for some other reason you need your deadline extended, you can request an extension to substances at ec.gc, or yeah, back to Environment Canada. They recommended that you give them a minimum of 5 days before that deadline. But I don't get the impression that if you sent it the day of, that it will be that big of a deal. But it's important, if you need a deadline to submit this, to go ahead and send it to Environment Canada. So obviously, I've spent a lot of time unpacking this subject, and this will not be the end of PFAS materials in Canada. So I really want to hear from you all what you would like our voice to look like when it comes to this subject. I have reservations about the process that they're going through, and the exemptions they've made on the materials. That I think that's really kind of a tricky place to start. That it's obviously something that does need to be addressed, but how we address it will matter. Um, so going into 2025, one of the major changes I'll be working on at Fenestration Canada is providing members reports so you can get a summary of what our actions look like here, and what the regulatory environment looks like. Um, and once as we get more opportunities to provide input on PFAS materials, I will be making sure that whatever comments you give to us is being put through their public feedback system. Um, so, long and short, that's kind of what it looks like. Thank you all for listening. I am open for questions.
We just had a question here by Anonymous asking, is the declaration resistant to manufacturers only or importers as well?
So anyone that is, so it's importers or manufacturers. If you have material that is coming into Canada, the reporting requirement is for anyone selling in Canada. For anyone that is interested to talk a little bit more about this, feel free to raise your hand. Isabel will get you on a mic, and you can come join the conversation.
Okay, there's another question here asking, in short, do you know what components of windows and doors may have PFAS?
Yeah, so there's a couple different places that it could be showing up. And I guess it's worth noting that PFAS materials have had a bit of regulation over the last 10, 20 years that have been slowly kind of pulling them out of systems. But gaskets would be a good candidate for it. I guess I should just go back to the benefit of PFAS materials is their durability, their fire resistance, and their water resistance. And so gaskets are going to be a great place for them. We talked with a glass supplier, and one of the things that I thought it might show up in is neat coating. Um, it doesn't seem to be showing up there as far as that supplier was concerned. But again, the reporting criteria for this is really tricky because you wind up with too little PFAS material for the SDS or HPD requirements. To Mark's question, yes. PFAS or PVC can contain PFAS materials. One of the members that we talked with had a large amount of profile extrusions, and that was a trigger. But it was just barely a trigger for an extremely, it was for a very heavy quantity of PVC. Kind of goes back to my comment on the 100 kilogram reporting criteria that after, 1 million pounds of PVC lineals, that triggered a reporting requirement for PFAS materials. There's an anonymous attendee. Importer of record is obligated, may not be the seller. Correct. Um, Correct. Yeah, not the seller, the importer of record. You're absolutely right about that. And that's even the way that I have heard some of the language written from Environment Canada on this. It seemed like once it is declared further upstream, meaning if your PFAS material manufacturer declares at the top of the selling chain, then it's not really a requirement for anybody else. That as long as they know where they were selling it to, it's hard for me to wrap my head around where that line was supposed to start and end. Is it already mandatory across Canada to submit before January 29th? So mandatory. It is worth noting that this is not a regulation. The it is mandatory because it has been posted to the Canada Gazette, meaning that it is something that we have an obligation to do. Mandatory is maybe I'm just getting hung up on the words, but yes, across Canada because it was posted to the Gazette, you have a requirement to go ahead and do this. That's probably the easiest way for me to answer that. So I can go ahead and ask Isabel once this is done for me to go ahead and have her send out the presentation to those members that have joined today. So I will make sure that she gets this so it goes out to you hopefully in the next couple days.
Mhm. And then the video will be posted afterwards on our YouTube, probably in the next couple of weeks.
Will Canada Customs reject or fine whole window unit imports from manufactured in the US or other countries? No idea, honestly. This is kind of Environment Canada's first stab at this subject. They just are trying to gather information. Again, I'm disappointed that they exempted so much of what I consider the consumer impact portion of PFAS materials. But yeah, it's hard to know what they're actually going to do with that data once they have it. Um, so the next one, to clarify, this reporting poses a greater issue for raw material importers than it does the seller of the final. Absolutely. I would say unless you are one of the top three window and door manufacturers in the country, I have a really hard time imagining that you hit the reporting criteria, frankly. Both because you're unlikely for it to show up in anywhere that you can prove that you have it. And then secondly, because unless you're bringing in a very high quantity or a large amount of weight of material that has PFAS material, you're unlikely to, qualify for that 100 kilograms of criteria. So as I understand, we declare if we know the profiles we import has PFAS, we report if we suspect it may have, and we report even if it doesn't have. Correct. So yes, if you know you've got PFAS material in your product and it meets the reporting criteria, then you go through the SWIM or the single window input method. If you suspect it might, then you can go through their second option there. Though you have no responsibility to. If you can't prove it, then you actually don't have to. But you do report if you don't have it, and that's where that DNE do not engage, no non-engagement is going to come into play. All right, so next is another anonymous attendee. Is this likely to show up if in any composite SMC material or polyurethane insulation? If so, is it expected to be significant enough amounts to trigger reporting? Great question. Honestly, I think my most the most honest answer I can give you is I'm not sure. I would have to look a little bit deeper to see how much PFAS material is typically used for the manufacturing. But if I had to go with my gut on this, the answer is probably no, that it probably doesn't trigger the reporting. But that's probably yeah, it's part of the problem with this particular requirement. And Mark Williams, what paints typically contain fluorosurfactants? Great question. And I have yet to find anyone that has told me that there is any PFAS material in their paints or the type of paints that they have. What I've read is a variety of research articles that continue to point to paints, but I don't find most of it to be very specific. So if Sherwin-Williams or anybody else out there that deals in paint and might have better insight, I would love to hear from you on this particular topic because it's really tricky. Another anonymous attendee, if an importing manufacturer ships into Canada and has two different importers of record, does that split the volume that may be allowed for them not to report? Probably. Probably. I hate to put my hands up on this one, but yes, I think you probably wind up with a split production, which might decrease your likelihood of having to report. Um, okay, so another anonymous attendee. Just for fun, consider my situation. We import materials into Canada that contain PFAS and will trip the threshold. Hence, we need to report. We then manufacture product and sell it back into the US, tripping the TSCA reporting requirement. Those products are sold into Minnesota as well, tripping the Minnesota requirement. This is driving me to drink. Yep. And worse, when you get to the US, you have a much higher. So going back to the presentation, we in Canada only have the requirement to track for 2023. Unfortunately, in the US, you've got tracking from 2011 all the way to current. And so yeah, the US is really tricky that not only do you have that, but you also have regulations that are state specific. And so I hate to say count our blessings in Canada, but count our blessings. All right, that was impressive. Thank you so much for all of the questions. I'm going to stay on for just a little longer and see if anybody else has anything that they would like to ask, or they'd like to join on the call and speak a little bit more too. I will say I'm very pleased that the knots that I used to tie Terry up obviously are working well. So there is that. All right. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone that came and participated. This is a 30-minute tech talk, which I don't know if we've done. Oh, we've got another question. There are third-party companies approaching to help with declaration, claiming PVC profiles definitely contain PFAS. Is there a value to go with them? Third-party companies approaching to help with declaration, claiming PFAS materials. Hmm. You know, it's a really good question because, again, I think we do have a responsibility of the due diligence to figure out whether or not we have PFAS material in our market. That, regardless of what is being exempted and the potential health effects of kind of the consumer eating portion of the PFAS market, we still have a responsibility to try to clear as much of this out from our manufacturing as possible. So honestly, that's a bit of a risk assessment, I think, is as an individual company of whether or not you should go do that. But if it's within your reasonable call it effort to pull that information, then yes, I see value. But it's very much a risk assessment. You as a company and what your values are is kind of going to be my answer. All right. So, is there any expectation on bans for PFAS? No idea. Again, we're too early on to have a good feel for what this turns into. I think it's a reasonable assumption that we will see additional bans and additional regulations that will encompass PFAS material. But uh, but yeah. All right, Tony, you got your hand up. All you.
Oh, good job, Adrian. I really, you did a great job on that presentation. I learned a little bit about PFAS as you were talking, so that's excellent. Just to clarify a little bit on the PVC piece. So we asked all of our suppliers of PVC ingredients to declare whether or not there's any PFAS in any of the additives. And as far as the PVC profile on its own, there was no PFAS declared. The only areas where we saw some PFAS could be in either the coatings or the laminates or the capstocks. So just to be careful that it's not, um, it's not necessarily in the PVC extrusion itself, but it could be in some of the decorative um, components that you add to it. And again, it's on the importer, not the um, it's on the company or the organization that imports it into Canada that it has to report. So once it's used in a window, and if you're not the importer, then you don't need to report. And
That's a
then
great
even I have
clarification. I appreciate that, Tony.
yeah. So the not required to declare, is that mandatory or is that an option? I understood it was an option to not declare.
Yeah, what I read through their guide is that is a part of the reporting requirements coming from that regulation. Yeah, but again, this gets into what is mandatory here, um, as it's not intended to become a regulation. So yeah, at least in the guide, they were explicit that they wanted the D&E as well. If you weren't going to report any PFAS material.
Yeah, so that's my impression that they would like you to report that, but it wasn't um if you do have PFAS, yes, you were required to report, but if you didn't, I thought the understanding was that that option was up to you. But I guess the devil's in the details, right? So
Devil's in the details there. Yeah. I can't say that I'm 100% on which direction I read as intent for that. I think they worded it in such a way that they probably didn't give us a lot of clear guidance. Yeah. All right. I've got another question. Ezadine, I apologize. Not likely to enunciate your name correctly, so I'm gonna do my best not to butcher it. But Ezadine Eshit, can you come back to the percentages of substances? So if what you mean is the um, percentage of compliance. Can you clarify your question, whether or not you're asking for the different amount of grams for manufacturer, import, and use, or talking about for the safety data sheet and health product declarations? And if you raise your hand, you're more than welcome to join on part of this call. While you respond on your side, if it is the safety data sheets, SDS only requires 1% per weight for PFAS materials. HBD is roughly 0.01%. What that actually is 1,000 parts per million is the voluntary, and then 100 parts per million is the mandatory requirement for HPDs. If I'm quoting that correctly. If anybody here has gone through the HPD process and I've misquoted that, please feel free to correct me. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, it looks like Terry managed to catch us right at the end. So those knots apparently did suck. So there we go. All right. Well, without any other questions, I want to thank everyone and everyone have a great holiday. We'll see you when we get to 2025.